We're really happy that you're all here. The seminar series is hosted by the School of Global Development at UEA and is an offshoot of the Successful Intervention Pathways for Migration as Climate Adaptation Research Project that is supported by the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Network of IDRC and FCDO. My name is Dr. Ritika Subramanian, and I co-convene this seminar series with Professor Nitya Rao and Dr. Mark Tebbeth at UEA. We're really honored to have with us Professor Jonathan Rigg today. And for those of us who have studied development, agrarian change, migration, I'm sure have come across Professor Rigg's work, which is why it is indeed a big honor. I'll do a quick introduction and then we'll move on to, the main seminar talk. Jonathan Rigg is Professor of Human Geography in the School of Geographical Sciences at the University of Bristol. He was formerly director of the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore, and before that was based at Durham University. He's been working on matters of migration and agrarian change since the early 1980s in Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, and Nepal. And he's written 10 books and more than 100 papers. Over to you, Professor Rigg. I'll begin sharing the presentation.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ritika. Right, we'll just wait for the screen sharing. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I'll talk for about 35 or 40 minutes. The presentation could be longer, so what I'll do is if I find that time is sort of getting a bit tight, I'll kind of whiz through things. And unfortunately, Ritika has to work through my slides. I haven't been able to do it from my end, showing my incompetence.
No.
So what I want to do today is, explore this connection between migration, climate, and development, so that kind of nexus. And I'm going to be drawing on work in Asia that I've been doing over, 40 years. So an awfully long time, right back to my PhD in northeastern Thailand in 1982. So there's a kind of long, I don't know whether it's a track record of success, but there's certainly a long track record. Next slide, please. Right. So first thing to say is that the work I'm currently doing draws on research we're undertaking in the villages I did my PhD in 1982. We've been doing re-studies over the last 40 years, and that's with the people you can see on the slide now: Wasana, Monchai, Albert, and Matra. So some of the things I've been presenting, not just my own work, but the work I'm doing with those 4 scholars as well. Next slide. So kind of 3 provocations to get us going. I mean, many of you will be familiar with Amartya Sen's work on famine, where he made this kind of remarkable observation that famines are actually not about a lack of food. They're about an inability to command food. Next slide. And I think there's kind of similar work on climate change vulnerability. I think if you think of the work of people like Jesse Rebo, who says that actually climate change vulnerability does not fall from the sky. It's embedded in the structural conditions in which poor people live. And therefore we need to take a step back. And then the third provocation is that maybe actually the development outcomes of migration are not really about migration. And I think all of these 3 provocations, which are making us think differently about our objects of attention, famines with Amartya Sen, climate change with the work of Jesse Rebo, and in the context of this presentation, that migration, maybe we need to be less obsessed about migration and more focused on the structural conditions and that within which migration sits. So if we now move on to migration, I've got a kind of set of quotes here from mainstream organizations, prominent scholars, and I'll just kind of run through them quite quickly. So the World Bank in 2009 making this statement: countries do not prosper without mobile people. And then Bird and Dashinga saying overwhelming evidence that internal migration can lead to positive change in both sending and receiving areas. UNDP, for many people in developing countries moving away from their hometown or village, can be the best option open to improve their life chances. And finally, the World Bank again, people move to make their own lives better. What all these quotes are doing, I think, is setting up what I kind of call here a migration development quadruple win, which is saying that migration is good for those who move, for those who stay, for destinations, so the countries of settlement, but also the places of settlement, and for places of origin, again, countries and localities. And those four things kind of paint a particular picture of migration as being, all round a positive thing. Those who move, those who stay, the places they go to, and the places that migrants come from. But if you think about it, that kind of quadruple win is only possible because of the way that we frame and think about migration. So most traditional migration studies focuses mainly on those who move. It focuses on questions embedded in the economy, broadly kind of situated, and matters of production rather than reproduction. So a kind of question for me is what happens if we change the frame? What if we say, well, actually, we want to look at those differently. We want to focus as much on those who stay as those who move. We want to think about questions of care and reproduction rather than economy and production, and maybe a concern for affects rather than effects. And if we do those things, in effect, what we're saying is that we're changing who we count, so those people who we pay attention to, what we count, so what exactly are we tracking over time, and thirdly, where we do those things. So where do we place our focus? So what I want to do over the next sort of half an hour or so, just checking the time, is kind of dig into that changing of the frame and where that leaves us. So we start with those who stay, often rather derogatorily called, the left behind, as if they're somehow left out of the equation. So we start with them. And I imagine many of you will know this lovely study by Showell, where she says, migration studies suffers from a mobility bias. It's one of those moments, a bit like Amartya Sen saying, actually, famines are not about a lack of food. Here's Showell saying that the trouble with migration is that we focus too much on migration. And actually, maybe what we need to do is think about people who don't migrate, because of course, immobility, if you like, is the other side of the coin from mobility. And people move because others stay. If people didn't stay, people wouldn't be able to move. So in a sense, by only focusing on the migrant and migration, we're ignoring a significant part of the equation. So as I say, obviously, I've got here why when some move, others have to stay. I mean, the classic example of that would be when children are left behind to be cared for by either uncles, aunts, or grandparents, or whoever. So in a sense, people are able to move and leave their children behind, the left behind, because others are willing to stay and pick up the pieces. And the second element of this is that we can see migration inscribed in the physical landscapes of the places where people leave. So if we go back to those landscapes and we look at them, we can see, if you like, the social and physical landscapes being rendered in new ways through the act of migration and the process of migration. So what I'm suggesting to you is that we need to shift our lens of analysis, that if we want to address that paradox that I started with, that kind of that provocation, that maybe migration and the development outcomes of migration are not about migration itself, but about something else. What if we shift our lens of analysis? And as I've got here, we move from production to reproduction, from those who work to those who support such work, and from economics to care. So if we do that, maybe something kind of a new and slightly different perspective on migration comes to the fore. And to illustrate this, I'll start with this this figure here. This comes from some work that I've been doing in Thailand. This is a if you like, a household footprint, a livelihood footprint of a household in northeast Thailand, that the shaded blue are the only individuals who are in the village. Everyone else is outside the village. So they're migrated for various reasons. There are children and grandchildren. Some of them are remitting money back to the natal household. And so what we have here is a kind of complex nexus of production, reproduction, and redistribution. We have care going on in the village. So on the kind of bottom right, the school child aged 7 years being looked after by their grandparents, while that child's parents are working and remitting money. So we need to kind of sort of map migration within the context of a multi-sited household and a multi-sited livelihood in this way. And often our kind of conceptual models don't adequately capture this sort of movement. I mean, if we think of the household as a co-residential dwelling unit, people all living under one roof, classically eating from one cooking pot, that sort of definition, that doesn't help us in understanding a household like this, where most people are out of the frame. They're out of the village, they're out of the household, and yet they're a functional part of the household. And this quote I've got here is from Catherine Locke, who used to be at UEA. I don't know if she's still at UEA. Yes, nodding. This wonderful quote from one of her, Catherine Locke's respondents in Vietnam. I love this. If I want to provide for them, my children, I have to migrate. But when I migrate, I cannot take care of them. And I think it's a really nice way in which that sort of two sentences captures the dilemma that people have. Next slide. Yeah, so in a sense, the provide is the production element of the discussion, and the care is the reproduction element. And you can see in this quote from Catherine's studies that, this individual, this female migrant, trying to work out how she can both provide, as in generate the income to lift people out of poverty or improve their livelihood or whatever, but at the same time care in that more affectual sense. So this is where effects and affects kind of come together in a really interesting way. So this is where the kind of the who, what, and where of migration comes into the frame. Who are we counting? We're interested in stayers as well as movers. What do we count? We're interested in economies of care and not just economies of production. And where we count them, we're interested in people who are, as I say, left behind, I think unfortunate term, as well as those who move. Okay, so let's kind of dig into that a little bit more. Yeah, next slide, Victor. Thanks. This is a quote from a interview that we did, it says on the bottom, 6th of November 2023. And I suppose what this quote does is it highlights that kind of navigating production and reproduction, a little bit like Catherine Locke's respondent in the last slide. This is not easy. This is fraught with difficulty. And you can see at the end, she's saying, there is no one to take care of our parents here. That is a huge tension. There is no income. And if I don't go, there is a lot of debt. Even living here, I have become depressed. I'm in a lot of tension. I'm thinking of going abroad because of the worry about the debt. So she's worrying, well, if I don't go, we're indebted. We're going to be in deeper and deeper trouble. But if I do go, who's going to look after my parents? Yeah. So that kind of production, reproduction, which slips so easily off the tongue of an academic, when it's actually put into place, and people actually navigating and negotiating those two elements, this is really fraught with challenges for households. So then there's the where we count. I used that term remittance landscape just now. I think it was coined by Deirdre Mackay, her work in the Philippines, as far as I remember. But the idea of landscapes being shaped by migration. And this is a photo of you can see here, terraced fields abandoned in the mid-hills of Nepal in Daguna, being colonized by trees. And you sort of think, how's this happened? In an area where people struggle to achieve food security, some of the most productive lands standing idle, maybe abandoned. You think, what's driving that? And if we are going to answer that question, we get pulled into migration's numerous effects. So smaller land holdings, lack of in situ opportunities, so lack of jobs, and ideational change, so people's aspiration leads to outmigration. Most of that outmigration is male, at least international migration. So people traveling to the Gulf states, to Malaysia and so on. And that creates local labor shortages. Yeah, there aren't enough people to farm the land. That means that herds decline in size. That means that goats are no longer grazing land, eating young trees, and land stands idle. Because of that, the forest begins to regenerate. It begins to advance from the peripheries into formerly cultivated areas. And that means it brings wild animals closer to settled areas. It means that sometimes the women who are left behind are anxious about going to the furthest fields because there are wild pigs, monkeys. I mean, people say even tigers. I'm not sure in all areas that's true, but anyway. And that means further production losses. Further production losses means there's yet more incentive for outmigration. And there's also a seriality to this, by which I mean that one might work in two ways. One migration event leads to the next. So people get kind of dependent on migration and the remittances that flow from migration. You know, it's not a one-off thing. You know, you can go and migrate, you make, you know, money, you come back, you build a house, you settle down, and that's it. So it becomes repeated, but it gets transmitted from one generation to the next. So I think there's a seriality to migration in those two ways. People get kind of tied into migration, both individuals and across generations. And this is a photo I took in Timor a couple of years ago, I think 2023. And when we were here with farmers, they were saying that these slopes you can see in the background, that formerly these were deforested slopes, you know, eroded, degrading, and they'd be like the forest, they've been reforested because of that sequence of events that I talked about earlier. And you can see a quote here, one of our transcripts of people talking about how wildlife incursions are creating a whole new set of challenges for people who are trying to continue to cultivate their land, even while others leave their fields idle. Okay, right, I think we're okay on time. So finally, on this sort of part of it, what we count. So I've done kind of who we count, where we count, what we count. And in thinking about this, I'm kind of thinking about what's sometimes called the production boundary by economists. So in other words, what's the boundary around which we draw our production equation, if you like? And I want to do this in terms of studies that I've been doing in these two villages I mentioned right at the start. So I initially studied households in this village in 1983. I went back in 1994, did a restudy of the same household, so it's a panel study. Then back again in 2008, and most recently in 2022 to 2023. So we've got kind of four slices through time, but I've taken the first and the last here, 1983 and 2022. So these are in situ and ex situ elements of household livelihoods that sit directly within the production boundary as it's usually drawn. So these are elements of production which enter the market system. Yeah, we can give them a price, a value, and those can then get recorded in national statistics. And then there's also some production which has to be estimated by proxy. Yeah, so it doesn't enter the market system. Classically, rice for home consumption, if you like, subsistence, rice production, and that has to be estimated on the basis of how much we think is being produced and what it's worth. And then there are some elements which are actually outside the production boundary. and I've listed them here: reciprocal labour exchange, gifts, care work, hunting, transfers of income, gifts of labour, and so forth. Yeah, these are elements which normally aren't counted. And so the suggestion here is that we need to draw quite a few of these activities within our production boundary if we're going to fully understand why migration occurs in the way that it does and what effects and affects it has, both on those who leave as well as those who stay. And this is a quote from a UN document, sort of observing how important it is for us to maybe think beyond the production boundary, where the UN writes, particularly in countries at an early stage of development, a large part of total household resources tends to be left out of GDP statistics. And that also applies at the kind of village level. So how do we bring this in to our view of what's going on? So that takes me from kind of the production element to the care element. And start with this graph, which, I mean, this is for Thailand, but I could have done it for Vietnam, many countries. This shift from youth dependency to elderly dependency. And these data you can see track forward to 2050. But you can see what's happening in 1980, when I was doing that work in Ban Non Dan Ban Ta Songkorn in 1983, you had relatively small, less than 5% elderly dependency, and a large chunk approaching 40% of youth dependency. And you can see those not completely reversing, but getting on for reversing by 2050. And this, of course, this aging population issue is something which is particularly acute in rural areas where I work, because most migration is by younger generations. So this kind of rather unfortunately termed geriatrification of farming, you know, the aging farmer. Most farmers in Thailand now are average age is over 50. Yeah, so there's an important generational element to the sorts of questions that we're asking in places like this. Okay, now normally, of course, in the global north, when you retire, I mean, I'm not far off retiring. I will have built up my pension pot. I've paid my national insurance. The state moves in, and if you like, picks up the pieces and hopefully supports you in later age. These are main sources of income in Thailand over the previous 12 months for people aged over 60 years of age. Next slide. And it's kind of interesting to compare these with, what's normal in, so Europe and North America. And there's a kind of, as so often, this sort of north-south distinction. And you can see here that the old age allowance, which you get awarded by the Thai government, it increases from 60 to 70, 70 to 80, 80 to 90. It goes, I think the top rate is now 1,000 baht a month. But that doesn't begin to pay the costs of support. And you can see here, around about 15% of income of those aged over 60 comes from the state-mandated old age allowance. So 85% has to come from somewhere else. And you can see a large chunk of it comes from the elderly who continue to work. So these aging farmers in rural areas that, I've kind of studied. And also significant amounts coming from children. So it's not parents supporting children as the household ages, it's the other way around. It's children supporting their parents. So the pieces are being picked up not by the state, but by children. So when parents care for their grandchildren, so the children of the migrants who leave, there's a kind of, I don't particularly like this term, but there's a sort of generational bargain going on that in time, the roles will be reversed. Next slide. And I'll show this for one household that I've studied since 1983. So this is the same household over time. And here is the household in 1983. The male head of the household was absent in Saudi Arabia at the time in 1983. The de facto head in Nanterre was Tongbai Pathanagan, 39 years old, and you can see that they have 5 daughters from 8 to 18. Next slide. This is the same household in 2008. Unfortunately, the male head of household died in 2007, so shortly before I did this follow-up survey. You can see that Tongbai is now 63 years old, and all the daughters, with the exception of one who died in 2002, have left the village, 1 working in Oman, 3 working in Bangkok. So you've got a kind of absent family here, and you've got 1 aging family member left behind, and they're remitting money back to this aging family. Now we go to the next slide, and this is the situation in 2022. You can see that Tongbai is now age 79. One of the daughters has returned to look after her, and she works as a pig farmer in Ban Nanterre, and the other daughters are still working elsewhere. So what you have here is a sort of interesting way in which care and economy, production and reproduction sort of alter over time. And this is the sort of thing that we need to pick up. And it reflects two things. I'll come on to this in a moment. It reflects the development eras through which people live. Because of course, over this time, Thailand was changing. Yeah, it was moving from a low income to an upper middle income country. But there's also a generational story here of how this particular household has navigated production and care over time, over the life course. And those two things kind of come together. And of course, I will say of course, but not these things, it's possible for one of these young women, so one of these daughters is being born in one development era, maturing in a third, and in a second, and retiring in a third. So development has kind of been concertinaed in such a way that rather than living through individual eras, they're actually living across development eras. So I think things to note about the migration stories that sit behind this. One is that migration in the 1980s, mostly male, mostly driven by scarcity. Yeah, people didn't have enough money, and they needed to move to do that. In the 2000s, it had become female as much as male, and it was aspirational. It was no longer kind of existential in the sense. And thirdly, there's something I've said already, there's a seriality to this, that migration in one era begets migration in the next era. And I mean, just to link this to literature, this is Sharon Lersch's really nice study in Transactions of the IPG, I think it is. They write of the invisible economies of care in India. And they say this: they seek not to demarcate production and reproduction, but to show how production and remuneration of migrant labor in the migrant destination hide the value produced by an entire economy of care of that labor back home. And I think that's kind of what we're trying to pull into the frame. So just to sort of link these together. So what I'm sort of saying is that there are limited opportunities in rural areas. This sort of first picture, this is of the mid-hills of Nepal. We need to connect that up to migrants leaving for the Gulf countries, the second slide. This is in fact is a group of migrants from South Asia going to Saudi Arabia. This picture was in, anyway, another, there they are flying from one Gulf country to the next, and also migrants to Kathmandu. And we then kind of see that inscribed in those who are left behind in the sending communities, and also the remittance landscapes that I talked about earlier. All of these things, of course, are of a piece, and they require us to do this shifting of who we count, what we count, and where we count those things, if we're going to pick up how migration operates over time, space, and different population groups. Right. Okay, next slide. So just to sort of return to this sort of question of how life course and development eras, how they intersect. This is a graph of GDP growth and GDP per capita from 1981, roughly when I started my kind of work, through to 2023. Yeah, so this is for Thailand. You, of course, could do it for other countries as well. Next slide. So in 1983, I was working in a semi-subsistence rice growing economy in northeast Thailand. Yeah, not many people, well, most people didn't even have bank accounts. Yeah, so classic semi-subsistence context. Next slide. By 1984, Thailand had become the fastest growing economy of any size anyway in the global south. In fact, in the world, it was double-digit growth, extraordinary transition from laggard economy in 1980s to miracle economy in inverted commas by the 1990s. 2008, you see mechanization of production in the village, lots of people absent, improving aspirations, changing production landscape, and so on. Next slide. And in 2022, Thailand is an upper middle income country. So, this is the sort of development. These are the development eras through which we need to understand migration. Yeah. So that earlier slide I got of that one household, the kind of Pathanagan household in 83, 2008, and 2022, that sits behind this sort of graph, this change. And if you like, disentangling era-defining change from life course change, from individual events, that's sort of the thing we're in the business of trying to make sense of. So this is migrants from, in fact, not non-Dan Tarsangkor, different villages, but it kind of serves my purpose here. This is migrants leaving from 1974 through to 2012. And what I'm kind of sort of interested in here is that, of course, this occurs because of development, but this also makes development. Yeah, it's because these young men and women kind of decided to leave the village that things could change, that the export-oriented factories that were locating in and around Bangkok, in Bangkok's extended metropolitan region, they were looking for labor. And most of that labor was rural. So people were leaving places like this, these villages, to go there. And that's a big decision to make. So development creates these opportunities, but of course, in this way, it makes development work. Yeah. Otherwise, if the labor didn't come, things wouldn't follow. Next slide. But as I say, these are not the same migrants. Yeah. The migrants from the 80s were peasant sojourners. They were leaving home as rice farmers, and they were intending to return as rice farmers. The ones from, say, the turn of the millennium on were worker sojourners. They had secondary school education. They were completely different. Yeah. So migration, is of a piece here in the sense that you see people leaving, but they're leaving under very different circumstances, with different skills and different ambitions and aspirations. And then, of course, how we then, as I say, embed that in the life course. So this is one household we interviewed in Nakhon Ratchasima, and you can see her kind of decisions across her life course. Yeah, and that sits within the context of the development era sort of context that I talked about just now. And a little bit like Catherine Locke's respondent in Vietnam, she said to us, I must stay here in the village because if I'm away, I don't know who would take care of my parents, and because there is no one else here to work on the farm. So that sort of sense of having to return at some point, yeah, and the ties that link people. And therefore, well, put here, family members who move and those who stay are intimately, by I mean affectively, and productively or effectively connected. These things are one and the same. They're part of the same production boundary. Right, I've got a few I have 5 more minutes, I see. This is something I've been playing around with. I've not kind of really shown these before. This is the age and years of education of the heads of household in these two villages in Thailand. And you can see in 1983, almost everyone had 4 years of primary level education. So these are the sojourning farmers I talked about just now. If they were leaving home, they were leaving their villages with the expectation they were going to return. Next slide. This is the same village, this is a panel survey in 2008. And you can see most of them by 2008 had 9 years of education. They saw a future for themselves outside farming. They were kind of de-agrarianizing individually. Next one. And this is 2022. They now have 12 years of education, different capacities to aspire, different ways of thinking about the future. Yeah. So yes, they're all migrants. They're all going, somewhere else to earn money. They still have effectual ties back to their village, but these are very different individuals. Yeah, with different ways of thinking about their futures, different skills, if you like, to sell in inverted commas, different ways in which they can engage with the modern economy, and also different ways that they can or can't engage with the farm. Yeah, many of them now have never farmed because the extension of childhood, I mean, that early graph, 1983, people had finished education, young, men and women, boys and girls almost, by their early teens. Now they're still in education and in their early 20s. Yeah, so in a sense, they've never, and we talk to households in this, and we say, well, can your grandchildren farm? They have never been to the rice farm. They wouldn't know how to do it. So anyway, so it changes both what you can do at home and what you can do away. Next slide. So finally, how do we then come to understand migration? And this is sort of high level stuff. Are we interested in the national economy? Is that what we're interested in? You think back to the quotes I took from the World Bank and the UNDP in, I think, the second or third slide, right at the beginning of the presentation. Migration is good for everyone. This triple win, quadruple win. Good for the economy, good for those who leave, those who stay, destination, and source communities. Well, if that's the case, what are we measuring? Are we focusing on the national economy? Yeah, and merely deciding whether, say, Nepal is a richer place because of migration? Or are we interested in rural spaces? Yeah, what happens to that money when it gets remitted back to the source communities? How is it invested? This is the 7-Eleven store on the outskirts of the two villages that I talk about. So this is the houses in 1983, the picture in the top right. This is what it looks like now. Yeah. Part of this is because of remittances, people having available. Yeah. So is that what we're interested in? Next slide. Or are we interested in agriculture? I mean, if you go to the mid-hills in Nepal, this is what faces you. Yeah. Is this the kind of development outcome of migration that we're interested in and we're thinking of measuring? Next one. This is an abandoned homestead in Thanh Hoa in Vietnam. Yeah. So what's sometimes talked about or as the hollowing out of communities. Yeah, is that what we're going to measure? Then households divided across space, juggling with that quote from Catherine Locke, how can I provide for them and care for them? Yeah, how do you navigate that? And finally, individuals. This is a migrant worker. I took this in Singapore. Every morning I would bicycle to the National University of Singapore. I'd park my bike, you can see here the bike parking kind of frame. And one day I turned up and here's a migrant worker, nowhere to live, lost his job, maybe. Yeah. So yeah, maybe richer, but this is precarious existence. So what is it that we're focusing on? National economy, rural development, agriculture, communities, individuals, households. And depending where we look, so it's not just what we measure, who we measure, and where we do it, but also they are that entry point for how we think about migration. So to take us back to the beginning, and then I will be just about on time. I said that climate change vulnerability is not about the climate, and I also said that the development's outcomes of migration are not about migration. And in a sense, if we're interested in the nexus between migration and climate change, we're connecting these two things, both of which, in a sense, are not very much to do with the thing that they're putatively about. Yeah, that actually it's not climate change per se that we should be looking at, and it's not migration per se that we should be looking at. So when we're thinking about this nexus between these two things that maybe we're often have this tendency to think about in a way that doesn't actually get to the nub of the point, which is, how do people build livelihoods across sectors, spaces, and generations? And if we do that, I think in an odd sort of way, we need to push both climate and migration into the background. Take a step back. I mean, that classic expression in English, to see the wood for the trees sort of thing. If we're going to see the wood for the trees, we need to not obsess about the climate change on one hand and migration on the other. And this is a quote from a paper that's sort of essentially saying that. Okay, I think I've finished, haven't I? Ready to go. Yes, look at that. And just about on time.
Thank you so much. I mean, this has been a very compelling presentation and a lot of questions that we're also grappling with as part of our own project. I'll now open it up to questions. We have around 18 minutes, so please feel free to, probably, raise your hand and then I'll just invite you. Do we have any questions? Yeah, Nitya, please.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think that was really quite inspirational and sort of, I don't think I've formulated my question very well yet. But I guess apart from sort of production, reproduction, care, economy, I think towards the end, you also raise this issue of scale or, or social institutions really, in terms of where you start. And wherever you start, it's going to look different probably. And I guess, I mean, it's very interesting. It could be very interesting from a sort of discursive perspective, like if you look from the perspective of the state and national development, or if you look from the perspective of the individual. And I'm just kind of wondering whether there will ever be a kind of meeting point, or, I mean, this is a very interesting discourse of tensions and contradictions across scales. What's a winner for the national economy is a loser for the individual who's sleeping on the, who's shelterless. So how do you actually think about, where does this take us in terms of the scale of analysis?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you probably guessed from the presentation, most of my work is kind of the ethnographic end. I tend to sit down with farmers and migrants and talk to them about, their aspirations and that sort of thing. And I think that probably came through in the presentation. But I do like surveys. I mean, I know surveys are not very kind of groovy now, but actually, questionnaire surveys I find really useful in setting the context within which we can situate the ethnographic. And I think in some ways it's a shame that, at least, I mean, in geography, my field, I would say that there's been a continuing resurgence of ethnographic work, more qualitative methods, which, I mean, certainly fantastic material coming through. And I think often surveys not being done. And I think that means that it means that I think people in policy don't kind of take our word for it. Yeah, they like to see the data to support. And I think that in general, in terms of research, is a shame, because I think it gives the ethnographic work that much more weight. Because there are two, what surveys do is, of course, they tell you the scale of the issue, the level of migration, or whatever it is, the distribution between genders and generations and that sort of thing. And then, of course, you can situate your ethnographic kind of studies in there, which allow you to answer the why questions. Why is it that people leave these villages? Why do they return? Why haven't they sold their land? what, yeah, and all those why questions cannot be answered through the kind of survey work. So I think I think that, I mean, in general, it's kind of a shame that in geography, maybe we don't do as much of that sort of survey work as we should. I think I mean, last thing to say on this, I mean, the high level survey work, though, I think loses something. I think, you know, when you see the aggregated data and statistics on migration shorn of the way in which migration occurs, the effects that it has, and so on. I think, you know, for me, that doesn't really get to the sort of issues that I was trying to highlight over the last 40 minutes or so.
Thank you. Kwame, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah. First, thank you for this insightful presentation. I have a question related to gender. In fact, the presentation has showed us the relationship between production and reproduction in connection with climate change and migration. Now, I didn't see any take on gender roles in that, but generally in literature, you see that the migration has a kind of effect in gender roles because women would take some role which were not their own role before, and this expand the gender inequality, existing gender inequality, and so on. So I want to know what is his take on that. And maybe I will exemplify with my own experience. Yep. I left my family home to be here in the UK for a PhD, and I've been in communication with them. And I see the impact on my kids' education because my wife takes some roles, but in the community, even the children know who is responsible of what. They don't really, I don't know, cope with their mom taking some roles related to my authority. So this is directly impacting their educational outcome as well. And even my wife has to be leaving some parts of her own production activities to devote more time to some other tasks. So I see this is a kind of more pressure and hassle. What's your take on all that?
Yeah, I'm sorry if the gender element didn't come through. I mean, certainly it's part of the story, and I mean, I think I touched on it several, well, now and then. I mean, most, you know, the work we're doing in Nepal, most international labor migration is male, yeah, and it leaves women, leaves them behind, again, in inverted commas, as and to be kind of de facto heads of household. And that I mean, there's an ongoing debate by kind of feminist political ecologists and others about, you know, is that a double or a triple burden? You know, does it empower women to do things which previously they didn't do, or does it just leave them with, you know, enormous demands on their time? And it sounds, Kwame, as though, you know, some of those are the things that you're having to navigate personally. So, I mean, there's a really interesting debate about that. I mean, the countries that I've worked, if you look at the Philippines, you know, a lot of the migration actually is female rather than male. And that, if you look at the work of people like Rachel Pereñas, you know, it leaves a kind of crisis of masculinity, you know, men having to look after daughters and not being able to do that. So, I mean, a whole set of issues there. I mean, if you look at Thailand, when I started doing my field work, most migration was male, relatively little was female. And then round about the turn of the millennium, maybe a little bit before that, actually, female migration became as important as male. So that's why I was, I suppose, probably going on for too long about this issue of kind of development eras. There was an era in the 80s when I could have painted migration as mostly male, leaving women behind, sometimes in difficult circumstances to manage the land, to hire labor in a context where traditionally they didn't have to do that sort of thing, to take on tasks. I mean, I remember once going to a village where I saw a woman plowing the land, and that was very rare to see. Ploughing land was men's work, not women's work. And when I sort of asked her about it, she said, well, someone's got to do it, and there are no men around, so I'm doing it. So, it changes kind of the norms of behavior, allocations of labor between men and women and that sort of thing. But I mean, now it's as much women migrating as men. So there is a really important gendered element. It changes. The question of whether it actually burdens those who are left behind with additional work, which actually they struggle with. So this question of, is it struggle or is it empowerment? Yeah. And in fact, Lata's worked a lot on that sort of thing. So she's probably got more to say than I have. So yeah, definitely. I mean, I agree with you. And I'm sorry that didn't come through because it was meant to be part of the discussion.
Thank you.
Lata?
Yes, thank you. That was great. And I really hope that you are going to share the recording, because I'd love to be able to share it, especially with students, because it's just very, very accessible. Sort of really that unsettling of dominant ways of thinking about how we move. But actually building on that, I wonder if, how do we think about the ways in which we're seeing maybe some sort of global convergence? Because one of the things that I'm really struck by is the ways in which the sorts of things that you're describing, Jonathan, are not necessarily like development specific, right? So I'm struck by the ways in which we're getting the reasons we move, the consequences of the movement, and the ways in which they actually speak to a lot of what's happening, for instance, in the UK. So if we were to move that lens of how we think about movement, then we can reimagine why, say, people who are asked to, if they want social housing, you have to move away from your social networks in one part of the country to go and live somewhere cheaper. And if you had a lens of care, you would understand very quickly why that was deeply problematic. I mean, you shouldn't have to fight so hard, but that different lens really helps to say, okay, well, actually, that's not a good idea, because you're not just interested in the movement. And I'm thinking here about the prevailing orthodoxy around, well, get on your bike, right? So, Norman Tebbit saying that 30 years ago. So this idea that we would link sort of, progress or aspiration and even jobs. And I just wonder to what extent, I appreciate where your work has been, right, for your whole career. And I love the fact that you're revisiting, but just that sort of escalating the theorizing, if you like, sort of cut across that developing divide, because I just feel like there is so much of what you're saying that resonates with how we need to be thinking about migration in our own context, and also then putting into the spotlight all of these efforts to stop people moving. So here I'm thinking about Fortress Europe and like all the money that's being given to, Libya, that's actually creating new forms of like trafficking and slavery. So in other words, just that thinking about, well, actually, can we problematize migration differently? And then how do we all benefit from that lens that you're bringing? Because I don't think that's a Southeast Asia specific thing at all.
Yeah.
And thank you.
Yeah, no, good question. I mean, I kind of, I'm always, it's a bit of a dilemma for me because, well, I mean, this presentation has come from, the School of Development Studies at UEA, that somehow there's a bunch of countries that get studied, in the school and taught and learned about and read about that. And there are a bunch that aren't, yeah. But what happens when one lot moves into the other sort of neck of the woods? How do we deal with that? How come? So I kind of take that. But at the same time, I'm thinking of Friedman's book, The World is Flat. I don't know if you remember that, came out, big, New York Times sort of thing. And I kind of read it and I thought, no, the world isn't flat. And if we flatten it and we say, well, actually what happens in the UK and what happens in Thailand or India, it's all of a piece, it doesn't really matter. I think that's not a road I particularly want to go. I think that's kind of, I mean, not dangerous, but I think it sort of, it assumes that when places appear to be the same, they are the same. So to give you an example, in most of the countries I study, people haven't sold their land. Yeah, they still have their 2 hectares or smaller plots of land. At the end of last year, I was at a meeting in the FAO. Yeah, it's kind of puzzling. I mean, these countries have gone through, they're upper middle income countries. They've gone through extraordinary sectoral change, children have been to university. They're not selling their land. Why on earth not? Yeah, because that was what happened in North America and Europe. Yeah, you had, land was accumulated into larger units of production. Farming went from a way of life to a business. People migrated to cities. They dislocated that connection with rural areas. Done and dusted. That was it. It hasn't happened. And the latest data from the FAOs, based on the 2020 agricultural censuses, show that it's still not happening. Yeah. And that says something, that despite the fact that migration and sectoral change and educational and aspirations, yes, they're kind of moving some of these countries into, developed countries or high income or upper middle income, there's still stuff that means that it's different. Yeah. And the kind of question then is why? And I think when you dig into why, then you begin to realize that, well, we got to be a little bit careful about assuming that in this era of globalization, we're all developing countries, or the world is now flat. We can just go with one kind of approach. So kind of yes and no, as usual, unhelpfully, latter.
Thank you. Mark and Chandni. Yeah, Mark.
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks very much for your presentation. I missed the very beginning. I've got a slightly poorly child at home, which is kind of occupying me. So apologies for missing out the beginning, but really, really fascinating stuff. I've got a few questions. So I was trying to work out which one I wanted to ask the most. And I guess for me, it's really around the kind of the rural futures. Like you've talked a lot about the way in which these places have evolved over time through these different eras of development. You talked about the hollowing out of villages and the geriatrification of farming and all of that sort of stuff. But I guess it would just be interesting to hear from you what kind of future do you see for these villages? Whether you see them kind of re-emerging and starting to thrive again, or just kind of withering, or maybe there's a kind of a broader kind of scaling up of agriculture, mechanization, kind of whatever it is. Just your kind of take on how you see these places evolving over the next, I don't know, kind of 5, 10, 15 years or so.
Okay, good.
Sorry, Jonathan, I think Chandni had a related question. So
okay.
we'll take it together if it's okay.
Chandni, yeah.
Okay.
Hi, Mark. We're always on the same page. Thanks so much, Jonathan. I'm Chandni, based at IHS, also part of the project team. And I had the same question because as someone working in climate change, both locally in India and then internationally, the conversation around climate change in rural areas has somehow made this homogenizing connect that rural areas are no longer places to be because agriculture is impacted by climate change and there's going to be depopulation, outmigration and all. So similar to Mark, given your long history looking at Asian agriculture and rural livelihoods, what's the future really? And how do we as researchers think about still making an argument for the future of rural areas as being meaningful? Yeah, because I think there seems to be this understanding in the policy conversation that rural areas are kind of dead, but any migrant you speak to, at least in Indian cities, their aspirations and dreams are still to go back to their homes, and that's why they don't sell land, as you're saying. So
both. So thank you, both of you. Excellent questions. First thing to say is that when I look back over kind of my notes or my PhD field diary, boy, I'm mostly wrong rather than right. So when I go back to my notes from 1983, there's no prescience there at all that Thailand would be the fastest growing economy, miracle this, miracle that. Yeah, there's absolutely none of that there. So my ability to misread the runes, and actually not to see what is just over the event horizon, is staggering. So, take everything I say from now on with that in mind. But, in the work that we've done, in Sri Lanka and Nepal and Thailand and Vietnam, similar, as you were saying, Chandni, so that people are not selling their land. And when you sit down and you talk to them, and this is kind of where the ethnographic bit comes in rather than the survey, you say, why haven't you sold your land? You're not even using it. And they say, you think about it. There was the Asian financial crisis, there was the global financial crisis, there were the floods there was COVID. And when the chips are down, when you lose your job, where do you go? Yeah. So you go back home, and home for many of these people is, their rural natal communities. So I think the precarity of non-farm work in the era of late capitalism and the persistence of sub-livelihood, holdings are, they come together. That's why. Yeah. And at times of crisis, I mean, I'm thinking about an interview we did. I see Wasana's on the call with Wasana, and we interviewed someone. They said, "Well, our neighbours sold their land, and they can never buy it back. Yeah, when you've sold it, it's gone. Yeah, you'll never be wealthy enough to buy your land again. It's a bit like selling your house in London or whatever. You'll never be able to buy it again unless you kind of win the lottery or whatever. So people have, they keep their land, even when they're not using it." That said, I mean, like both of you, I think, I kind of wonder. I mean, some of the, the people in their early 20s that we're working with phoning up or visiting, or, they've got university degrees. And you think maybe we're just waiting for, if you like, the next generation. Yeah, we're waiting for attrition to occur as one generation leads to the next. This comes back to one of my points, actually, is that the thing about somewhere like Thailand, I mean, my career has spanned semi-subsistence rice farmers to late capitalist university graduates. Yeah, those are the people I've been. Yeah, that's all in my one career. Yeah, so in a sense, the agrarian transition as it worked out in North America and Europe has been collapsed, concertinaed into about 30 or 40 years. So maybe if I was still around and gave this talk in 10 years' time, maybe bang. The natal bond with home will have been cut, but so far it hasn't. And when you talk to people, they say it's jolly good we could come home during COVID, during the financial crisis, during, whatever, because the state won't pick up the pieces. I mean, that's the last thing to say. Yeah, and which came through in that graph on, how did the elderly support themselves, either through work or from their children, not from the state. So if the state is not going to pick up the pieces, then boy, you're going to protect those things that might support you at times of crisis. And I mean, in Africa, we had Komi, wasn't it, talking about Africa. During the AIDS crisis in South Africa, I worked with Flora Haidu at Uppsala, at the SLU in Uppsala. And, during AIDS, where did people go to die? Yeah, who was going to look after them? It wasn't in the cities. So rural places are not places just, I mean, it comes back to this production and reproduction, not just places where you grow rice. It's places where you go to retire, to die during crisis, as places of succor and support, where although kind of notions of moral economy are, we can kind of challenge it, there is still that kind of figment of the moral economy that means that people are kind of mutually reliant. They depend on each other. So I think, for the time being, but I'm probably going to be wrong, as I say, I think the rural still counts. And that links back to Lata's question as well, actually.
Thank you so much. We've run out of time, but we have comments from Julie. If you want to summarize, or do you want to take a look at it, Professor Rigg?
Yeah, no, I saw that.
Yeah, if you want to briefly respond to it before we end the discussion.
So where's it gone? We're presuming all people in the village have land or enough to make a living out of. Yeah, many don't. Yes, I mean, there are, well, maybe two things to say. Of course, it varies between kind of country contexts. I mean, there are around about 400 million smallholder farmers around the world. So it's quite a large number, something like that. So if you look at the work of Sarah Lauder, kind of from the FAO on that, and I think it's kind of question of not just who owns land, but who has access to land. So and how people access land. I kind of think one of the interesting issues is how elderly generations hold on to their land and don't pass it on to younger generations. So that kind of question of, I mean, the work of Ben White at the ISS in The Hague, is it that young people don't want to farm or that they can't farm? What's the issue there? Are elderly generations sitting on land and preventing younger people coming into? Yeah, that's kind of ongoing debate. I mean, I'm not sure I completely agree with Ben. I think a lot of young people actually don't want to farm, but his argument from Indonesia is actually a lot of people would like to farm, but they can't. So is it access to or exclusion from land that's going on? But I accept Julie's point. I mean, I haven't talked about landless rural people and men and women and how they get by. I mean, occasionally migration can help in that. I mean, help. If you like, labor shortages then create jobs for those who don't have land. So sometimes that has been one of the outcomes of migration, creating kind of working opportunities that didn't previously exist. And labor rates. I mean, there's an ongoing debate about returns to labor in rural areas. Sometimes it appears that they've improved, sometimes not. But I accept, and land being divided up within families. Yeah. I mean, last thing to say, most holdings are sub-livelihood. So they're not large enough to support a family, which means that you cannot rely on agriculture in that sense. So I think there are, at least in the countries I work, there are very few households that can live off agriculture. The same as, I mean, it's interesting work coming out of the US. I mean, most farms in the US are loss-making enterprises. Yeah, most farms in the global south, you can't raise a household. So multi-stranded livelihoods, multiple sources of income, people doing different things in different places. I mean, that is pretty much, I would say, a kind of common theme across the Asian context and maybe the African context as well. The work of Deborah Bryceson and stuff on de-agrarianization as well, I think, kind of chimes with that.
Okay, on that note, thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and thank you, Professor Rigg, for this insightful conversation. We will be making the recording available and we'll send it across, and also stay tuned for the next seminar that we'll be advertising soon. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks everyone for listening to me.
You.
Okay, bye.
Thanks so much. Yeah.